Hi everybody and welcome to today's Saturday session. Today we are going to be discussing inflation or cost of living, the increase in cost of living as it's commonly known. This has obviously been an unbelievably topical subject over the last 12 months, but specifically the last 3-4 months. This is something that I would be unbelievably surprised if you will not see some inflation questions on Leaving Cert in June. Obviously it's been very, very commented about in the media. There's lots of articles that they can reference in questions. The budget was very much billed as a cost of living budget and a budget to tackle the increase in prices. Obviously the energy crisis, the invasion of Ukraine, and still that legacy of COVID have all caused supply chain issues, which have linked mainly to an increase in the cost of living due to cost of production rises. So it's really something to be aware of. Lots of articles available, worthwhile really familiarising yourself with the topic. So today, throughout this session, we are going to be looking at the factors that actually cause inflation in the first place. I'm going to show you how to calculate the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, to explain the effects of inflation on the Irish economy and the economy in general, and then we're going to practice some exam questions. So the definition of inflation then, it refers to the increase in the general level prices, or what we're going to be aware of, the increase in the cost of living from one year to the next, which is probably our most common definition. Three types of inflation then that we need to look at, which could come up maybe in short questions, could come up as part of a long question, just in case, straightforward definitions and maybe a little bit of an example to cover you. So creeping inflation, this is where a country is experiencing a low and steady rate of annual inflation. So it's an annual increase in price levels, and that's usually below 5%. The opposite then is rapid inflation, a large increase, where countries are experiencing large increase in price levels, maybe something like 25%. And then we have these cases that you hear in the news every so often of hyperinflation. Venezuela being our most common example recently, where a country experiences a massive increase in the general price levels, which then erodes purchasing power, consumer confidence, and confidence in the country's currency. So you're hearing stories of, wheelbarrows of cash to buy loaves of bread, etc. So the currency becomes completely devalued due to hyperinflation. If we move on then to the causes of inflation, this would be something I'd be flagging as a possible exam question this year. It's obviously very, very topical. It's something that is still going to be topical up to Christmas or into the new year, which is when roughly exam papers are made, sometime around the November to January time, usually maybe into February. Inflation, cost of living is still going to be topical at that time. The budget is going to deal with a lot of cost of living increases, so it's definitely something to be aware of. It has come up in 2021, did come up in 2022, but still topical. So maybe look at some of the other factors that didn't come up those 2 years and really focus on those. So if we look at the causes, number one would be demand pull. A common area we see this would be the housing market in Ireland, especially Dublin. So it's when the total demand for goods and services is greater than the total supply of goods or services which are available for sale. So essentially there is excess demand. So what that does is that pulls up the general level of prices. So hence the reason demand pulls. So the excess demand is actually pulling up prices because there's too few goods. So too much money chasing too few goods. As we mentioned, something you see a lot with the housing market, specifically in Dublin. The Second cause of inflation could be the easy availability of credit. Not so much at this particular time in Ireland, but it is something that did happen in our previous booms. So it became too easy to borrow money from banks and other financial institutions. That increase in money supply can cause inflation also, because there's more money floating around the economy. So a third one then would be cost push inflation, and this is obviously very topical at the minute. That can be linked obviously to COVID from previously, linked to Ukraine and Russia war at the minute. So very, very topical and one to keep a real eye on. So the increase in the costs of production for companies can be passed on to consumer in the form of increased prices. So increased wages, raw materials, again our energy crisis, which is the most topical thing probably at this particular time. So well worth revising that one and making sure you are aware of it for the exam in the summer. The fourth one could be again linked to this, are energy prices and Ukraine and COVID, which is import inflation. If a country imports raw materials for production and these materials increase in price, the cost of production will increase, and again this will have to be passed on to the consumer. So a lot of our goods that we need, everyday goods, obviously oil and gas, our energy, things like insulation for houses, so the building industry, the construction industry, timber, steel, all that, we import a lot of those goods. So we are very, very, very susceptible to import inflation in Ireland. Okay, so import inflation, cost push inflation, interlinked. And the fifth one then is indirect tax. So again, increase in excise duty on petrol, increase the transport costs of manufacturers and producers, and therefore cause inflation, cost of production increase, and again, as we know, who pays for it all? The consumers. The opposite of inflation then is deflation. Not overly topical at the minute, but again could happen in the next year or so, so something to be aware of. What it is there's, instead of an increase, it's a decrease. So if you think of something deflating, it bursts, slow leak, etc. Same as happening to the economy. So the economy is having essentially a slow leak, right? There's a decrease or fall in the general level of goods and services. And that's usually over a year. So it wouldn't be very, very rapid. It's usually quite slow over that year period usually. It's very, very dangerous for an economy, because what can happen is it can allow consumers to actually believe that prices may continue to fall. So it could cause the postponement of buying goods and services in the belief that they will become cheaper. Obviously that will, if there's decreased demand, then again that can lead to job losses. The government will have to step in. So as you can see, the last point here, it negatively affects employment and economic growth. Okay, less goods and services being sold in the economy, government might have to step in and increase social welfare, increase their expenditure, cut taxes, etc. So when it comes to measuring inflation then, we need to compare the price of a good from one year to the next. So in the exam, you have to construct a simple price index as part of a composite price index, but we'll deal with the simple price index first. And there's a simple formula for that, something you need to know. It's not in the log tables. Okay, that formula is simply the price in any year, right, usually year 1 or year 2, over the price in the base year, multiplied by 100 over 1. The composite price index then delves a little bit deeper and goes into a little bit more detail. It examines changes in the general level of a number of goods and services. And the importance, it also considers the importance, which is the weight, the amount of money spent on each good. And that's usually shown in a percentage figure. So there's 5 steps involved in constructing composite price index, consumer price index, and you can be asked to actually list these out, list out steps, so just be aware of that. In exam questions, or sometimes you might be asked for 4 out of the 5, they leave space for 4. Okay, so step 1 is you choose a base year, let all prices equal 100. Step 2, you select the goods to be involved and find the prices of all those goods for all the years. Then, as we've seen in the previous slide, you construct a simple price index, an SPI, for each good. 4, you multiply the simple price index by the weight, which is the proportion of income spent on each good, or the percentage of income spent on each good. And then you simply add each good's figures together to get the composite price index to give you a total figure. And there are your 5 steps involved. So you can often be given, if you're not asked to actually list out the steps involved, you'll be given a table, usually with 3 goods. In this case, we've got food, clothing and footwear, and other items. You see that each good has a percentage or a weight attached. The weight is never written in, but we know that the percentage of income spent on each good is the weight. And you're also given your price of items in the base year and the current year. Okay, so in that sense, you're given all the information you need to actually construct the consumer price index. I'm going to go through that with you now. First thing we're going to do is we're going to construct an SPI for each of the goods. Okay, so if we look at the first one being food, so our formula again, price of the current year. So I'm just going to write current year over base year multiplied by 100. Okay, so food then is 24.50 over 20 multiplied by 100, and that's going to give me an answer of 122.50. Okay. We're then going to multiply that by the weight, which is step 4, so multiply by the weight or the percentage, and in this situation the percentage was 40%. And you get a figure of 49. That's your answer there. Second one then, clothing. Clothing was 40 over 42. So the current year over the base year multiplied by 100. And that gives us a figure of 95.23. You can obviously use a calculator, I'm not doing these out of my head. And we multiply that by the weight. And the weight for that, for clothing, was 25%. So that gives a figure of 23.80. And our last one then was the other items. Okay, and that was current year 36 over 30 multiplied by 100. And that equals 120. And we multiply that by the weight, which was 35%. And that gives us a figure of 42. Okay, so we're then going to add the 3 of these figures, so 49 plus 23.80 plus 42 gives us a total figure of 114.8, which is our total answer. Okay, so very, very straightforward way of doing it. Not a difficult question. You have all the information in the question. It's just important really that you know the formula, current year over the base year multiplied by 100, and then that is multiplied by the weight, which is the percentage. And then you add your three figures together and you add them up. That is it. Very, very straightforward. So this is the marking scheme solution to it. Again, it's a little bit neater obviously, and sometimes they will leave you the space to actually do this, the workings for it. So again, you've got your categories, you've got your prices in the base year, 20, 42 and 30, and you've got your prices in the current year. So your SPI, simple price index, multiplied by the weight gives you your answer for each of it. So 49, 23.80 and 42. Right, gives us our final answer, as we said in the last slide, of 114.8. So what does that actually mean? That means prices have increased by 14.8% this year. Okay, so it's always the difference. It's whatever's added on to 100 essentially. Okay, so in this sense, 114.8, so that's an increase of 14.8%. So Consumer Price Index, sometimes called CPI. Okay. It's an index drawn up by the CSO, the Central Statistics Office, to measure the changes in the general level of prices over a period of time. So it does it by collecting 53,000 prices every month and comparing them to the prices from the previous month. Really don't need to worry about that too much. Just be aware of it. Sometimes they can ask for steps involved, which are pretty much the same as the Composite Price Index. So again, just something to be aware of. So what you can be asked more often is the uses or the importance of CPI statistics and also the limitations of them. But for this we're going to focus on the uses of them. So number one, it is the official rate of inflation. Alright, so it's the measurement used to actually say how much prices have increased from year to year, from month to month. So this is the one you will see on the CSO website when you're looking at your figures closer to exam time. Very topical at the minute. It's used as the basis for claims for wages, right, for any wage increases and for social welfare benefit increases. This would be something that trade unions would use to basically barter for their members. So they would look at the increase in the cost of living. They would look at the actual rate of inflation from the CPI, and they would use this as a barometer for what price or wage increases should match the price increases. So you often hear this idea that, wages should be index linked, right? And that's what they mean by the Consumer Price Index. Third one there, it's using as one of the economic indicators of the government's performance. So ideally inflation should be low. So if inflation is quite high, maybe it shows there's room for improvement in the government's performance. As most indices are, it's used as a comparison tool, right, to compare our price competitiveness on the international market. So how does our rate of inflation compare to other countries, and especially our competitors? And the last one, number 5 there, traditionally is used as the basis for the indexation of interest rates and tax bands. So there's still a bit of that, as I said, in point 2. It still links in with tax bands maybe for the government to decide any wage increases, or the flip side of that, if they want to raise taxes or lower taxes. As with most things that you're probably aware of now in the economics course, if there's uses or the importance of statistics, there is also limitations of them. And limitations of nearly every index is an average. So number one, limitations of an average or relevance. So it's based on the pattern, right? The average pattern of spending. But that obviously doesn't become relevant to every person. So spending patterns are individual and might not be typical of the representative pattern on which the official figures are based. Okay, so the CPI could be skewed in terms of, say, energy prices or construction prices, and that may not be relevant to every individual. So it's an average figure. It doesn't really affect everyone, I suppose. Again, you'll see that with another, national income statistics. They're averages. It doesn't apply to everybody, but I suppose an average is a good comparison tool, as we've seen on the previous slide. Second, it doesn't always include new products. So it only includes those products in the base year. It lags behind consumer trends and fashions. So new products aren't included. And obviously that can be a limitation. So it may not be a truly accurate representation of what's going on at that particular time. The third one then pretty much links in with that. It has a limited range of products. So most families spend their income on a very, very large range of goods or products. The CPI though only has 12 categories of products. And it's roughly 8,000 different products. Okay, and obviously we know there's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different products on the market at any given time. So again, it is a snapshot of it. So these are all limitations. So number 4 then is quite an important point. As it states, it's a price index, not a cost of living index. So it only measures changes to prices, and that's very, very important. It actually doesn't measure your cost of living. Okay, because it doesn't take into account basically everything that affects person's living standards, I should say. So it doesn't take into account income tax. So the government might decide to cut income tax, or they might decide to raise one of the tax bands. If that happens, then people will have more disposable income and they will have more purchasing power. Obviously, that's not counted in the CPI. So the CPI only measures the actual changes to prices. So that can be a limitation of it. And the fifth one, again, you've seen it throughout the course already. It doesn't allow for basically switching to a substitute good. Okay, we know what happens, especially in times of recession. People will switch to a cheaper alternative if it's available. So they tend to substitute cheaper products where they can. Alright? And CPI obviously doesn't take that into account. It doesn't measure that extent to which people may actually switch or when they switch. So it's just important to be aware of that. So moving on then, this would be another possible exam question to be aware of. The actual effects of inflation on the Irish economy. I suppose we're living it at the minute. You guys as economic students are living it, you're seeing it. You're seeing it in your family home and you're actually seeing it yourself. Alright, it is more expensive to buy goods. Okay. So what does that actually cause? It causes lower standard of living for one. So because of the higher costs, people have reduced purchasing power. Okay, and a lovely statement to always include is reduced purchasing power rather than say income drops or something like that. You're kind of showing off a little bit more. And that causes a reduction in their standard of living. Okay, so basically they can't buy as much as they used to with the same amount of money. So that can generally lead to number 2, increased wage demands. So workers who are experiencing a reduction in their standard of living would try to negotiate a wage increase to compensate for that higher cost of living. Or, as mentioned in the previous ones, their trade unions will use that. to you for trade unions. So they will look at the cost of living, they'll look at the CPI, and they will use that as a basis for looking for increased wage demands. Number 3 then, as again has been kind of mentioned before, can lead to a loss of competitiveness. So very simply, if the inflation level is higher in Ireland than that of our trading partners, our biggest competitors, essentially it results in a loss of competitiveness. So our goods are more expensive compared to other countries. So our exports will be affected there, more than likely. So 4 then can be directly related to 3 in terms of loss of employment, especially if that is from maybe that loss of competitiveness, especially in exports. So if employers are faced with those increased wage demands that we've discussed, and a potential loss, I should say, of exports, they may be forced to reduce costs. And generally, the first place they will look to reduce costs is their employees, either numbers employed or the hours that those people are employed. The 5th one can be a positive one for government finances. If there is higher prices, right, that can lead to higher revenue. So higher, especially indirect tax revenue. Our classic example is always VAT there. So VAT receipts can increase if the prices are higher. 6 then, savings are discouraged and consumption is encouraged. So if the inflation rate is greater than the nominal rate of interest offered on savings, the real rate of interest available to savers falls, thereby discouraging savings. So basically, people are not getting the reward for saving money. So if your savings, if the interest you earn on savings is not basically greater than the rate of inflation, your money is essentially less than it was before. So you need to be kind of staying ahead of the rate of inflation. So your interest rate must be greater than the rate of inflation, or else there's no point in saving. So again, you'd be more beneficial in actually spending your money. And 7 then is, as in all scenarios, where there is costs issues, there's always going to be disparity between different sectors of the population. While those at work may seek a wage increase to compensate for the drop in their living standards, those on fixed incomes, very important, they must wait for the government to decide to adjust their payments. So the likes of teachers, nurses, etc. Alright, they have to wait for the government to decide to change that. Are the government going to do that? Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't, but it does generally take time, and that can widen the gap between the public and private sector in those scenarios. So just before we move on to some Leaving Cert questions, just to reference the HICP, which is the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices, and this is what's kind of taken over from the CPI in a lot of scenarios, because it is the official measure of inflation in European countries, and again used as that barometer or comparison between countries to show the difference in competitiveness. So the reason obviously harmonised is in the title is because everyone uses a harmonised approach. So i.e. same method is used to measure inflation in each country. So it's important just to flag that. Can come up as a short question or possibly part of a long question. So just be aware of that. Okay, so here's some example of our questions, and this one is from 2021, question 14. So it shows, as we've mentioned there in our previous slide, the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices, shows the average inflation rate in Ireland, the UK and the Euro area in 2014. Okay, so the question asks you to analyse the trend of Ireland's inflation rate in relation to the UK and the Euro area in the years 2014 to 2019. So essentially comparing Ireland to the other two lines in your graph. So it's a straightforward enough question. You're basically describing what you see on the graph. And as we can see, Ireland's inflation rate, so Ireland is the orange, UK blue, and the Euro area is the grey. So looking at it, you can see that the UK was pretty much the highest for a substantial amount of years from the 2014 to 2019 bracket. Ireland was quite low, the lowest of the three really for the majority of the time. Small little area here. Okay, in 2015, where Ireland's a little bit higher than the UK, and that seems to be the only time that the UK inflation rate is lower than Ireland or the Euro area. So from that kind of 6-7 month period roughly. So literally what you're doing is you are referencing the graph, you're giving the years and you're giving the actual average inflation rate. So like Ireland is pretty much below 0.5 from the majority of 2014 all the way up to the end of 2017. So it's only a short little period there, and it's a very, very small increase above 0.5. So you're talking about from 2018 to 2019, it's going from roughly 0.5 to 0.7, right, which is lower obviously at the time than the Euro area and the UK. So this is the official marking scheme then from the SEC, and you can see that it was 12 marks in total. So your first point was 6 marks, and then you needed another 2 at 3 marks each. So as we mentioned, they give us suggested responses, so these are the main ones you need to be looking at. So across the entire time, Ireland's inflation rate is lower than the Euro area and the UK, apart from 2015, the UK at just above 0.5%. So look at that. From 2014 to 2016, the inflation rate fell in both the Euro area and Ireland, whereas it started to rise in 2015 in the UK. From 2015 in the UK and 2016 in the Euro area and Ireland, the inflation rate started to rise. And in 2018, the inflation rate in the UK and the Euro areas began to fall. So literally just explaining the actual graph itself. So what has happened? No trick questions there. Just making sure you're given enough information. General rule of thumb, if they don't ask you or they don't tell you how many reasons they're looking for, give 3 reasons or 3 points. Okay, that would be my general rule of thumb. If you can fit more in or you know more, fantastic, give more, but I would say 3 reasons as a minimum, just to cover yourself. So the second part of that question then was outline the potential advantages to Ireland as a country of maintaining the lowest price inflation relative to these other areas over this period. Again, they've given you a substantial amount of lines, so they're looking for detailed answers. Again, I will go with my 3 points. Okay, as a minimum. As I said, if you can, include more. Okay, so we see they're only looking for 2 points, but why I say the 3 points, okay, this could have changed on the marking scheme. So maybe this might have started out as maybe 3 points at 4 marks each, but the marking scheme can change, so just be aware of that. Like for some answers they'll be looking for 3 points and they won't tell you, and for some they'll be looking for 2 points and they don't tell you. So ideally aim for 3, and in this situation you'll be marked on your best 2. Okay, so the 3 plus 3, what does that mean? That means 3 for your statement and then 3 for your explanation. Alright, so the first one there, straightforward enough, more competitive exports. So Irish prices will be lower than in the euro area, which means that our exports are more competitive, and that's going to result in increased exports, which should lead to increased employment also. Alright, and an added benefit, maybe we might get more tourists deciding to holiday in Ireland because of that point. Secondly, it should lead to competitive costs, which should have a knock-on effect. So if we have lower prices, we should have reduced costs. So that should maintain our competitive prices. That means the business can expand, all right, or innovate in new products, which is all good for the consumers. And that potentially will act as an incentive for foreign firms to locate in Ireland. So FDI, foreign direct investment, should increase, which is a big bonus. The third one then, we should have greater domestic spending and savings. There should be reduced demand for imports, and there should be less demand for wage increases. So if we have low prices, we're competitive, as I mentioned, it may encourage an increase in spending within the economy because people have more money. So that obviously benefits our domestic employment and our economic growth. Alright, it also helps to maintain the value of savings, as we mentioned previously, and citizens may be encouraged to holiday in Ireland due to competitive prices. So rather than actually going abroad, which is often the cheaper alternative, actually holidaying in Ireland could become cheaper, which is a win-win for everybody if we could have the weather. The last one then is government finances. So if we get increased spending, we're going to have increased exports potentially, we're going to have potential increase in employment. All this leads to increased government revenue. Okay, so that is fantastic, and that allows the government then to have more money to decide on how to spend it and how to actually improve the standard of living within the country. So it's a win-win for everyone. So part B then states that we're looking for 2 possible disadvantages. So it tells you in this part of the question that you're looking for 2. Again, looking for a substantial enough answer. So your statement on the first line and then leaving about 4 lines for an explanation. Now, hopefully everyone's aware that there is extra space, right, at the end that you can move into if you need to answer or go into more detail on any questions. So it's just very important that you write the number. So question 14b, say part 2. You want to write more on part 2, you just label it like that in the extra space and continue. Give your examiner a little heads up that you're going to do that. Okay. So essentially low inflation is similar to deflation, which we kind of looked at already in the slide. So basically what we talked about is here consumers may postpone spending. Okay, this is because they expect prices to fall even further in the future. Because of that then demand will drop, so some firms may close down, and it may lead to a loss of service for the customer, which is not good to the customer or consumer. You get no or low wage increases, real wages increasing, or prices falling. Employers may only want to offer low pay increases or potentially none if they are under pressure. So hence they may find filling job vacancies difficult. So again, consumer could suffer there. The debt burden effect is the third one. So the real cost of repaying a loan rises. The real value of the borrower's payment increases. So borrowers lose out because the real burden of their debt rises. So their money basically isn't going as far as it did before. And the fourth one there, asset appreciation may fall. Low inflation rate may mean that assets owned by Irish people, such as homes and other investments, are not increasing as quickly in value, and this may negatively affect their return from such investments. So again, realistically, number 1 and number 2 there will be the two I would imagine most people will be most familiar with, and the ones you're probably going to include in an answer. They're the most common. Alright, the debt burden and the asset appreciation may fall are, they're options for you, but they're a little bit out there, I suppose. But again, these are just suggested responses. But if you're looking for two, I would suggest going with the first two. The second part of that question then was explain one method. Again, you're told one method the government could use to address rising inflation. Could be reproduced again this year, as it is something that is very, very topical at the minute, as we've mentioned so many times already. So 7 marks for this, 3 plus 4. So state again, 3, 4 for explanation. So you really need to be nailing your explanations here. Increased direct taxation, I should say. So you're talking about PAYE really here. Alright, direct being on the person's income, so PAYE or PRSI. If you do that, basically what happens is consumers have less money to spend. So that could reduce demand pull inflation. Okay, but the government will be very, very brave to increase tax when people are struggling. So it is one to be wary about. I think number 2 and number 3 are more relevant at this particular time. So decrease government current expenditure, which can happen. Government expenditure is an injection in circular flow of income. Decrease in government current expenditure, what it does is it decreases aggregate demand, and thus again demand pull inflation in the economy. So there's less money floating around the economy, which means demand pull inflation is lowered. This is the third one then, is very important, and we're seeing at the minute in terms of energy. Okay, so the government could essentially reduce the cost of energy. Government provided utilities is what it mentions in this one, but again, in terms of energy, that's very topical at the minute. That reduces the cost of production of firms, and thus reduces cost push inflation. So that means it's less expensive for the consumer than if they do that. So that is being flagged quite a lot. So government are possibly looking at giving money off bills, or maybe looking at tax credits. It seems like they're not going to implement an actual energy cap or cap on energy prices. But they do seem to be actually reducing the prices or giving people monetary value, like they have done previously, like a €100 offer bill or €200 offer bill, or maybe they might go a bit more in the budget, maybe €200 or €300 off the bill. Okay, so this is a question from 2019 again. Another question based on just a different type of an inflation question. So 25 marks, 3 parts. Explain the steps involved in constructing a composite price index. Distinguish between nominal wage and real wage. Nicely good concept to work on. And reference the table below, calculate the percentage change in real wages in each of the years 2014 to 2016 and show your workings. Okay, so even though it is 2019 on the old course, again still relevant to today's world, and stuff that can still come up on the new course. Okay, so the solutions to the steps involved in a composite price index, usually they look for 4 to 5 of these steps. So choose a representative base year. Okay, decide what goods to include in the composite price index. You gather the data, you need to find the price of each good for each time period being observed. Then you construct a simple price index for each commodity. you attach a weight to each good. What that means is it's the typical amount that a consumer spends on it, so a percentage of their income. You multiply the simple price index by the weight, so by the percentage, and then you finally add up all the price changes to get the overall change in price. And that is your step-by-step process. Part B then asks us for the difference between the nominal wage and the real wage. So our definitions for that are that the nominal wage is the wage before it's adjusted for inflation. Okay, so that's very important. Before adjusted for inflation, that being the key point. So it's essentially the money wage, whereas the real wage is the money wage adjusted for inflation. Okay, so it's the purchasing power of money. Alright, so the real wage is a better judge of the income you have, essentially. It's a better judge of the cost of living. This brings us to part C then, which is our table, and that is figuring out the real wage rate. The real wage rate is nominal rate minus the inflation rate. Okay, so plugging those questions or those percentages in, and we've got the first one, minus 0.2 minus 0.3 gives a figure of minus 0.5. Second one is 1.2 minus 0.3, which equals a 1.5, because 2 minuses gives a plus. And the last one then is 1.1 minus 0, which will give us a 1.1 answer. So that's actually a very straightforward question once you know the formula, which obviously is the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. And just be aware of the signs as well. You must put the signs in. So the first one is minus 0.2 minus 0.3, which gives us a minus 0.5. Our second one is 1.2 minus, always the minus. Well, here we've got another minus 0.3, so the minus and the minus gives a plus, so that's a plus 1.5 figure. And then the last one, 1.1 minus 0.0 equals 1.1. Okay, so really easy stuff, but once you know your formula. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our session today on inflation. Hopefully you found it useful and worthwhile and got something out of it. Lots of exam questions go through again. As I've mentioned at the start of the video, well worth making sure you are up to date with inflation and be familiar with the style of questions. So I have gone through some. There will be more coming up in videos in the future, so keep an eye on those. Just to recap on our learning intentions from the start. So we have gone through the factors that cause inflation. So both demand pull and, which is more prevalent at the minute, cost push inflation. We've calculated the CPI using our simple price index and shown you exam style questions. We've looked at the effects of inflation on the economy and how that has linked to the Irish economy at the minute. And then we went through some other exam questions and practiced those. Okay, so as I said, hopefully you got something out of it. Keep an eye on the social media channels. There'll be more videos going up, and hopefully I will see you at our next Saturday session. Thank you guys. Bye.